Where are those who claim that Ibrahim Traore only has online supporters? One article even referred to it as the crazed cult of Traore. But if Traore is truly a fraud, as these critics suggest, why is the West still scrambling to deepen ties with Burkina Faso under his leadership? You see, when General Langley made that outrageous statement about President Traore, he had no idea of the backlash he, and the United States, would face from the entire Pan-African community. But that is exactly what happened. Now, just a few days ago, President Trump sent an envoy to Burkina Faso to meet with Traore and offer a diplomatic apology on behalf of General Langley and the U.S. The meeting also aimed to explore the possibility of renewing diplomatic relations between Burkina Faso and the United States. The question is, should Burkina Faso agree to renew ties with the U.S.? And if it does, what should the nature of that partnership be? We're going to unpack all of this and more in today's video. On May 27, 2025, the U.S. Under-Secretary of State for West Africa, Mr. Will Stevens, paid a visit to Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou. That evening, he was received by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Regional Cooperation, and Burkinabe Abroad. After exchanging warm greetings, the American emissary stated that he had come to reaffirm the United States' desire to rebuild strong cooperation with Burkina Faso. You see, since the coup, U.S.-Burkina Faso relations have been strained. As you're aware, President Traore has deliberately shifted away from Western alliances, choosing instead to strengthen ties with non-Western partners. Moreover, like the European Union, the United States was among the first to condemn the coup in Burkina Faso and went so far as to suspend aid to the country. At the time, the U.S. made it clear that it would not resume diplomatic relations unless President Traore stepped down and returned the country to civilian rule. However, just as he did with the EU, Traore ignored the demands and stayed focused on his mission. But that's not all the U.S. did. What many people don't know is that there was a specific reason why President Traore chose to abandon Western partnerships in favor of non-Western allies. You see, after Traore ended diplomatic ties with France and expelled French troops from Burkina Faso, he immediately focused on upgrading the Burkinabe Defense Force. At the time, the Burkinabe armed forces were in dismal condition. This, despite France having spent 10 years in the country supposedly to train and modernize the military. The reality on the ground was shocking. The Burkinabe military lacked proper weapons and ammunition. In some cases, they had to borrow weapons from neighboring African countries just to confront insurgents. Imagine that. Even with all the aid pouring in from the West, the civilian governments before Traore never prioritized strengthening the nation's military. And here's the most shocking part. French military instructors were reportedly training Burkinabe soldiers using wooden guns. Yes, you heard that right. Wooden guns. Meanwhile, the armed insurgent groups they were fighting were equipped with sophisticated, high-powered weaponry. How were Burkinabe soldiers ever expected to stand a chance against that? As a soldier in the Burkinabe military, Traore knew firsthand what the defense force lacked. That's why, from the very beginning of his leadership, one of his top priorities was to upgrade the military. He made the decision to purchase modern weapons and ammunition. Now, as you probably know, the United States and France are two of the world's largest arms suppliers. So Traore approached the U.S. government to buy high-grade military equipment, not on credit. The funds were ready. But guess what? The U.S. refused to sell weapons to Burkina Faso. And it gets worse. Not only did the U.S. reject the sale, but it also used its influence to block Burkina Faso from acquiring weapons from other Western countries. Just think about that. A sovereign African nation trying to defend itself, blocked from purchasing essential military equipment. Isn't that outrageous? The U.S. constantly claims it wants to be Africa's most trusted partner. Yet here it was, actively working to prevent an African country from securing the tools it needed to fight terrorism and protect its people. Is that how a true partner behaves? It's baffling. And honestly, there's no way to justify such a harsh and calculated decision. Maybe the U.S. believed that by blocking access to weapons, it could pressure President Traore into stepping down. But they underestimated something fundamental: human resilience. That moment opened Traore's eyes. He realized that the West was never truly interested in Africa's progress. Western African partnerships, in his view, had always been one-sided, designed to benefit the West, not Africa. So, he turned his back on them and sought out new allies beyond the Western sphere. For those wondering why President Traore chose to deepen ties with Russia, this is the reason. When the West turned its back, it was Russia, along with Turkey and Iran, but especially Russia, that stepped in and sold military weapons to Burkina Faso. Traore saw something different in the Russian approach. The relationship was straightforward and based on mutual benefit. Burkina Faso provided the money, and Russia delivered the weapons. No strings attached, no interrogations. If it had been the United States, things would have been very different. The US would have demanded to know why an African country wanted a particular weapon, and possibly denied the request entirely. That's how Russia earned its place as a reliable partner. But instead of acknowledging how their own policies and actions pushed Burkina Faso away, the Western media flipped the narrative. They portrayed Burkina Faso as having sided with the enemy, painting the country's alignment with Russia as if it were some dark alliance with the devil. Since then, US-Burkina Faso relations have remained tense. However, it now seems the US is trying to rebuild the bridge. That's why former President Donald Trump sent an envoy to Ouagadougou in an attempt to restart diplomatic ties. According to the envoy, "I come today with a message from President Donald Trump to work together to build a pragmatic relationship based on mutual respect and respect for the sovereignty of each country. We can collaborate, face our challenges together, and improve our relationship." Interestingly, it was the Burkinabe Minister of Foreign Affairs who held discussions with the US envoy. President Traore didn't even bother to meet with him. If this had been another African country, a weaker president might have rushed to the meeting simply because the visitor represented the United States. Instead, the meeting was handled professionally at the ministerial level. Together with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, both sides explored various opportunities for cooperation aimed at consolidating relations between the two countries. Several key areas were discussed, including trade relations and security cooperation. During the talks, Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traore welcomed the American initiative, particularly appreciating President Trump's decision to send an envoy to the ground to obtain first-hand information. But then, without mincing words, the minister laid down Burkina Faso's new diplomatic stance. He made it clear that Burkina Faso now operates under a new vision and a set of guiding principles when it comes to international cooperation. According to Minister Traore, the country is committed to building meaningful partnerships, ones that contribute to Burkina Faso's development as a truly sovereign nation. In simple terms, Burkina Faso will no longer accept partnerships that threaten or undermine its sovereignty. For far too long, the West has trampled on the sovereignty of African nations. Time and again, they have meddled in African affairs without the consent or consultation of the people most affected, Africans themselves. Take, for instance, a shocking move by former US President Joe Biden. Not only did he ban the Russian media outlet RT in the United States, but he also took it a step further, banning it across the entire African continent. That's right. Without consulting a single African government, Biden unilaterally decided that RT had no place in Africa, claiming it was being used by Russia to spread anti-Western sentiment. But it didn't stop there. Under the same administration, several Pan-African news outlets were quietly removed from major platforms like YouTube, again, without explanation and without consent. These actions are a clear violation of freedom of expression and a direct attack on African sovereignty. It's as if African voices are only acceptable when they echo Western narratives. Another blatant example happened in Niger last year. This time, it was the European Union. Without informing the Nigerian authorities, who had recently come under military leadership, the EU attempted to send aid into the country through an NGO. And how did the government find out? Not through official diplomatic channels, but through a public announcement made by the EU on social media, days later. This was not just a breach of protocol, it was a blatant insult to Niger's sovereignty. In response, the Nigerian authorities acted swiftly, instructing the NGO to return the aid package to the EU. These examples reveal a troubling pattern. The West continues to treat African nations not as equals, but as pawns, entities to be dictated to, rather than partners to be respected. With all this in mind, it becomes undeniably clear. The member countries of the AES value their sovereignty above all else, and they are willing to sever ties with the West if that's what it takes to protect it. This is precisely why the Burkinabe Minister of Foreign Affairs didn't mince words during his meeting with the U.S. envoy. He laid down the foundation for any future engagement. In his own words, as Burkinabe, as Sahelians, and as Africans, we want mutual respect and respect for our sovereignty. Africa is a continent like any other, and Africans are human beings like everyone else. We want a change in perspective and in narrative. We want to be understood. We must move away from condescending rhetoric and build our relationships on a foundation of equality. What a powerful statement. Indeed, Africa is a continent like any other, and Africans are human beings like any other race. But for far too long, the West has treated Africans as inferior, as if they were something less than human. In fact, during the dark chapters of slavery and colonization, Africans were often compared to animals, monkeys even. And while the chains of slavery and the flags of colonization may be gone, the ideology that fueled them still lingers. To this day, many in the West, and yes, even ordinary citizens, still view Africa through a lens of contempt. They see Africans as backward, uncivilized, unworthy of self-rule. In Western media, the name Africa has become synonymous with disease, poverty, war, hunger, and chaos. Rarely do they show the innovation, the strength, the resistance, and the rich culture of the African people. For the Western narrative, nothing good can come out of Africa, and that toxic perception has persisted for centuries. But now, a shift is taking place. And leaders like President Traore and the AES coalition are demanding that the world see Africa for what it truly is, not a helpless continent, but a rising one. Sadly, many African leaders have only made the situation worse. Instead of standing up for their people and driving real development, they've grown content with collecting aid from the West, lining their own pockets while their nations fall apart. They lack the ambition to build strong, self-sufficient countries. Instead, they use public funds to fly abroad, seeking good medical care, smooth roads, and luxury living, comforts that their own citizens can only dream of because they've failed to provide them at home. This culture of dependency has allowed the West to continue disrespecting Africa. The truth is, the West meddles in African affairs because many African leaders have shown incompetence and an inability to solve their own nation's challenges. But President Ibrahim Traore is different. He has proven that he is not weak, not a puppet, and certainly not incompetent. He is a leader who is willing to defend the interests of his country, even if it means standing alone. That's why the Burkinabe Minister of Foreign Affairs made it crystal clear. Burkina Faso will no longer tolerate any form of interference or any attempt to undermine its sovereignty. Put simply, if the United States wants to rebuild diplomatic ties with Burkina Faso, then it must start by respecting the country's sovereignty and staying out of its internal affairs. Minister Traore also addressed the pressing issue of Burkina Faso's security. He expressed deep regret that, in the face of rising terrorism, certain countries, including the United States, have chosen to prioritize abstract principles over on-the-ground realities. As a result, they have actively blocked nations suffering from terrorism from acquiring the necessary war materials and equipment to defend themselves. In response, the U.S. Deputy Undersecretary of State, who has held office since January 2025, pledged to personally invest in resolving this issue. He promised to help unblock the restrictions and support efforts to combat terrorism and its financing across the Sahel region. But the real question is, why did the U.S. block Burkina Faso's access to weapons in the first place? The answer seems obvious. Washington only started reconsidering its position after realizing it was rapidly losing influence in the Sahel. This isn't about helping Burkina Faso. It's about the U.S. trying to regain control in a region that is increasingly slipping out of its grasp. You see, when the United States makes a decision, it expects every African leader to fall in line without question. A striking example of this happened when President Trump accused South Africa of committing violence against white South Africans. In response, he suspended U.S. aid to the country. And what did the South African president do? Despite all his bold speeches and rhetoric about sovereignty, he went to Washington to explain himself to Trump, effectively pleading for validation. It was a moment that revealed just how submissive some African leaders still are in the face of Western power. What a weak display of leadership. In contrast, when the US blocked Burkina Faso's access to weapons, President Traore didn't fly to Washington to negotiate or beg. He didn't plead for reconsideration. Instead, he took decisive action. He found an alternative. That's exactly the kind of response we expected from the president of South Africa, but sadly, that was not the case. And now, look who came crawling back. It was the United States that came to Burkina Faso, not the other way around. That alone speaks volumes. What does this tell you? It tells you one powerful truth. The West needs Africa more than Africa needs the West. And the day African leaders fully embrace this truth is the day everything begins to change. Now let's move to the most critical part of this entire video. Before wrapping up the meeting, the Burkinabe Minister of Foreign Affairs raised a pointed and necessary question. What are your thoughts on General Langley's statement? It was a question that had to be asked. After all, Langley's statement wasn't just careless. It was a direct insult to Burkina Faso's sovereignty and dignity. The U.S. envoy responded carefully. In a classic display of diplomatic language, he said he came with a positive message to restore mutual trust and to boost a new dynamic of cooperation between Ouagadougou and Washington. In other words, no apology, no direct address of the insult, just damage control. It's clear that the powers that be in Washington realized General Langley had made a major blunder. They never anticipated the strong, united backlash his statement would spark, not just from Burkina Faso, but from across the African continent and beyond. His words didn't just offend one country, they exposed a deeper truth and shattered what little credibility the US still held in Africa's eyes. That's why President Trump stepped in, sending an envoy to Ouagadougou to diplomatically smooth things over. It was a classic move to control the damage, but one that confirmed just how serious the fallout really was. Burkina Faso, however, made its position crystal clear. The country is open to partnerships, but only those grounded in mutual respect and benefit. The moment that principle is broken, diplomatic ties with the US will end. No compromises, no second chances. And again, this raises the undeniable point. It is the West that needs Africa, not the other way around. If that weren't the case, why would Trump bother to send an envoy at all? Even more telling is what happened just a few weeks ago. The European Union, yes, the same EU that suspended all cooperation with Burkina Faso after the coup, also sent delegates to Ouagadougou to discuss the possibility of resuming diplomatic ties. What's truly ironic is that it was they who cut off the relationship. But when they saw that their absence had no impact, when they realized that Traore's administration remained strong and unshaken, they swallowed their pride and came knocking. It's no longer about who cut ties with whom. It's about who stood tall when those ties were broken. And in this case, it was Burkina Faso. In other words, the message that Burkina Faso delivered to the United States is the same one it sent to the European Union: mutual respect, mutual trust, and mutual benefit, or nothing at all. This marks a new era, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire Sahel region. The days of one-sided partnerships are over. Burkina Faso has drawn a clear line in the sand. The terms have been set, and now it's up to the US and its allies to either respect those terms or step aside. What do you think about this shift in power dynamics? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.